The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. On today's episode, we have Derek Schulze joining us. Derek initially carried out research in cardiac research and molecular screening of plant cell cultures before arriving at Niagara College in 2016 to teach for the School of Environment and Horticulture Studies. Derek and his wife Carlene put their academic research careers on hold to purchase and operate TJ greenhouses. The business supplied 156 major grocery stores throughout Ontario, with high-end bedding plants. The couple also operated their own hydroponic lettuce business. After 13 years, the family sold the business when Derek accepted a full-time position at Niagara College. Soon after arriving at Niagara College, Derek assisted his colleague Bill McDonald in creating the Commercial Cannabis Production Program, the first post-secondary credential of its kind in Canada. He has since left the cannabis program and returned to the Niagara College greenhouse, teaching a full schedule of courses to greenhouse technician students. Forever the scientist, Derek has made a point to include applied research learning into his greenhouse classroom. Now let's get into the episode with Derek. Welcome back, Dave and John. Always the overlapping. We also are joined again by Derek for this week's episode on energy operation in greenhouses. Welcome back, Derek.
Yeah, welcome back. Thanks for having me.
So diving right into the episode, where is energy used in a greenhouse? For instance, where are you using heat sources? Where are you using electricity?
Yeah, so obviously there's heat, which can be gas, wood. In some research greenhouses even use electricity. Geothermal, that's new and emerging. When it comes to electricity, obviously the biggest consumer of electricity in a farm is lighting, but not to be underestimated. Most greenhouses are hot water heated because that creates the best environment. I mean, you have sort of low cost greenhouses that have hanging unit heaters that just blow warm air, but those are less than ideal. So we'll focus on hot water because that's the majority of operators. Hot water heating systems have pumps, and there's main circ pumps, there's shunt pumps, there's zone pumps, there's booster pumps, there's pumps. And each one adds up. They're all using more and more electricity. So the electricity consumed by just the transit of hot water is not insignificant. Then there's electricity for whether it's mixing soil, irrigation pumps, high pressure fog pumps for cooling, conveyor systems for moving product to the greenhouse. The consumption there is fairly minimal, but generally speaking, the electricity required for grow lights is your number one consumer of electricity. And then your transit of water through the greenhouse is number two. And three would be, equipment.
Kind of tacking on to that, I was just curious. So you mentioned grow lights, and I know you previously mentioned that you used HPS lighting at your greenhouse. When you made those lighting decisions, did you have many options as, let's say, now with all the LEDs?
We did. Now, this was 7 years ago. And I think at that time, you're looking at around 1.7 joules per watt. We're up around 2.2. So the LED lights have improved in efficiency. So there's always, this is dynamic. But at the time, we opted to go with high pressure sodium lights. Now the farm we had magnetic ballast HPS lights. So I should distinguish, there's two kinds of HPS lights, and there's a big difference, right? There's legacy and then there's modern. Legacy lights are basically just a big copper wire wound transformer, and that steps the voltage up high enough to arc through your high pressure sodium bulb, right? That arc, because it's just a transformer, it's linked to the cycle of your supply electricity. So in Canada, that's 60 hertz, which means that the electricity is arcing across 60 times a second. There are internal resistance losses because of the magnetic winding. There's less light output because you're limited to 60 hertz. So basically legacy lights are they're efficient, but they're not as efficient as modern HPS lights. Digital high pressure sodium ballasts operate by using circuitry to step the voltage up using transistors and capacitors instead of a copper winding, which means they can operate at higher frequencies. And so you have more light output. And so for a given amount of watts going in, we had quite a bit more output. So the efficiency, and this is one of the things that really irritates me, is that high pressure LED researchers almost always compare their lights to legacy magnetic ballast lights because, hey, look at this vast, you will save 30% off your hydro bill. And of course that's a lie, right? Because they're not comparing it to the latest technology. So there was a couple of honest papers put out by researchers that compared LED lights to HPS lights. And at the time, digital HPS lights were still more efficient than LED. Now we have to move forward because we're at 2.2 joules per watt. LED lights are pulling ahead. And I think it's not like greenhouse growers, like I said in our last podcast, we're not ideological. We're business people. Okay. That means we're going to make a decision when it makes financial sense. There is no such thing as the religion of LED lights. I mean, there is with my students, but I like that Pastafarian guy who puts the pasta bowl in his head because that's his religion he created. Farmers are going to buy LED lights when it makes economic sense. And so I'm not going to say we're there yet, but we're close. So when we bought our lights, we bought digital HPS lights. We were incredibly happy with the results. The energy consumption was as expected. And we have done trials. We had done trials with LED lights. I still do LED lights at the college. Companies send us lights. We try them out. Some are fantastic. Some are horrible. I could probably do a whole podcast on grow lights because it's a complicated discussion. But one thing that I will point out, and this is even if you say that LED lights are 10% more efficient than an HPS light, that 10% sounds like a lot, but the 10% does not factor in heat. So in a greenhouse context, radiant heat from HPS lights actually is huge because it allows the lights to dry the crop and reduce disease incidence. So when growers switch to LED lights, they actually spend more money on fungicides. They spend more money using their heating system to dehumidify where they wouldn't have to do that if they had HPS lights. So looking at your overall energy consumption, it may actually in some cases go up if you have a crop prone to disease, like say cucumbers, or if you're growing gerberas, if you're an ornamental grower. So managing disease is something that, growers know, but salesmen don't. And so that's where switching to LED lights is a complicated thing. Second, another pillar with LED lights is that unless you're buying white LED lights, like there's really only one company on the market, Fluence, that sells full spectrum white LED lights. All other LED lights are individual colors put into an array based on a recipe that you specify for every single paper that has been put out using LED lights to grow crops has made note of altered growth properties in the plants. And sometimes they're advantageous, sometimes they're not. The plants evolved under our sun, right? The sun is not purple, it's white. I mean, it's yellow shifted white, but that's what the plants evolved under. And when we put the plants under LED lights, it's not normal. And so they don't grow normally, For example, leaves are darker and thicker, which can also mean that starch is lost in the leaves and not transmitted to the fruit or the flowers as effectively, which can impact yields. Probably the most recent paper that came out from University of Wageningen was with peppers, and yields were still higher under HPS lights, but the LED lights were catching up, but the plants were growing in very strange ways that they are trying to understand. And so I think there's just a lot of question marks, which is why LED lights are, unless the government's paying for them, you will not see a lot of them because there's just too many question marks and not enough of a definitive answer that you will in fact save energy.
Derek, you mentioned a lot of points that I've heard from different growers. I feel like every grower I've spoken to has a different perspective on it. And I think what I really like that you said is, of course, before these vegetables or ornamentals were grown with natural sunlight, and now we kind of have the ability to use all these different LEDs and all these different types of recipes. And it's really interesting to see kind of how now that these growers have options, how everyone differs. For instance, some still prefer the traditional HPS that provides that heat, whereas others I do find like the LED aspect because now they can kind of almost control another aspect, which is that heat part, and they can control these new recipes and things like that. So it has given, I think, even more room for innovation in the greenhouse industry. And I think it's going to be really interesting to kind of see the results as these LEDs get more trials in greenhouses and things like that.
Yeah.
So I've got 2 points and the next question, actually, Derek. So one, I think we're going to take you up on the next podcast to talk about strictly lighting in the future. So I'd like to slot that in with you at some time. And the second thing, it seems to me, based on what you're saying on the experimental side, that again, college or university that actually does that work, sounds like there's a really good opportunity to continue that investigation for the market. So again, that serves well, I think, for agri college and the work that you guys are doing. So here's my question, and it relates to actually the last podcast that we had with you. You explained that, you feel that the growers are pretty proficient in managing energy. And I'm curious if there was a place that they could make improvements in managing energy, where do you think that would be? And then part two of that question, what role could, academia play to help out? Because I know from the years of experience we have is that, Sandra just mentioned this, not often do people talk about energy or the energy business in academia. They'll talk about kilowatt hours, GJs, but they don't relate a business case. So anyhow, that's part two.
Yeah. That's tricky because we're pretty darn efficient already. I think that something that you guys offer, which is understanding the markets, especially when I'm thinking of the bigger greenhouses, I think that's an area where, unfortunately, we probably fall short. I do a little dabbling on the stock market, and, was I trained as an economist? No. Do I know much about all the companies I look at? No. If I'm looking for low hanging fruit, that's one. By the way, I mean, basically, I've made most of my money back that I lost at the beginning of the COVID with my stocks. So
Sure.
if you're wondering, it was a nightmare. But anyways, so yeah, that's one. As far as like the mechanics of day to day, there are programs that come around every once in a while where the government offers subsidies to encourage you to do certain things. Like I remember an easy one was they were encouraging us to switch to LED fluorescent tubes in our warehouses. And the government would kind of pay, electricians' costs were covered. It was a no-brainer, right? And warehouse lighting is not insignificant. These are big areas that are lit all day for people and forklifts and not. So those are sort of smaller things. Most farms are operating already at 3-phase, and they have most of their motors are 3-phase, which is already more efficient, less maintenance. I think we're at 50 little things as opposed to me pulling out one big ticket. I don't have a simple answer for you.
Yeah, well, I didn't think you could. It wasn't an easy question, but thank you for taking a step. So how about academia? What role could the college or universities play to help future growers in helping managing energy going forward? Is there anything else that can be done in academia from your exposure and experience?
I think so. And I think some has been done more recently. For example, glazing, different coatings on glazing. I know University of Waterloo, for example, local technology has been working with nanotechnology in glass to improve its transmissibility and also alter its retention of far red radiation, which of course means that it's really low heat transmitting glass that has also got really high clarity for letting as much light through. We did a really interesting project at the college with transparent solar panel. I think that that's an emerging technology that in the next few years will get better and better and better. So those are areas where academics, I think, can kind of fill some of the gaps. I know that the greenhouse industry is actively pursuing geothermal and trying to understand how to make it work, because obviously we have very high heat demands. And so geothermal is a bit unique. Can it be done? I know is it Germany? They're drilling the deepest geothermal well currently for a greenhouse. I think it's 4 kilometers down.
Well,
That's pretty far. Obviously, that's funded through academic research grants and engineering departments. And so I think academics have always been there to do the big dreaming, high risk stuff that businesses just can't undertake because, the average greenhouse needs, I'm going to say at most a 3-year payback. And so that kind of limits us in our risk taking.
the course content at the college as a grower is there much information provided or shared for budding growers on how to manage energy in the course?
I mean, it could be better, but we spent a lot of time teaching them how to operate a heating system properly because you can waste a lot of money in a hurry with boilers if you don't operate them properly.
Right.
So the theory of operation is we spend quite a bit of time. They come out of college understanding, what is three-phase hydro? Why is it important? We talk about lighting, but we do spend quite a bit of time on boiler operation. Yeah, literally, you can burn your profits up the stack if you're not paying attention.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you've talked about some of your experiences of what you've done with energy when you were a grower yourself. You've talked a bit about lighting and other things like that. I was wondering if you could share with us any other aspects that you think our listeners would be interested in, and adding to that, perhaps what tools and resources you relied on when you were an active grower, looking at the energy side of things.
Well, every greenhouse, they should by now have a computer operating system that runs the entire greenhouse. So growers are usually very familiar with how to use their particular operating system. And I mentioned in the last podcast that graphing is a really important tool that's used for disease management and energy tracking. It also is helpful in correcting mistakes. So, for example, our greenhouse had what's called an energy curtain, which is a curtain that has aluminum strips woven into it. And at the end of the day, the curtain closes and it reflects infrared heat back into the greenhouse. Energy curtains save you a ton of money. It's amazing. When you open the energy curtain in the morning, in the winter, there's ice on the glass. It hasn't melted. But as soon as you open the curtain, it's melting. So using your curtains, timing it with your boilers. So graphing on your computer system is absolutely critical. That is where you make or break your heating system and your energy consumption. Absolutely. Turning on your grow lights, for example, right? You have settings that determine when the grow lights turn on. And you can do it intelligently, or you can just set it on a timer. Most growers now do it intelligently, right? So the sun goes behind a cloud. Do you turn the lights on? Well, no, because maybe it's just one cloud. So you have a delay. And then when the computer says, okay, look, it's definitely not light enough. Okay, the light comes on. And then if you have a minimum amount of light you need in a day, you can specify that. The computer will integrate that value and keep accumulating it until it reaches your target. But now we're getting into parts where not all growers actually bother to set it properly. Not every grower's got it all figured out, but most do, especially now, I think, because they'd probably be out of business. I don't know if I answered your question entirely, but really the software is the key.
Yeah. And I think it comes back to something that you were talking about is when you're already efficient, improvements come from 50 or 100 small improvements rather than one big step change.
That's right. Like, for example, if just cut you off for a second, in the last 5 years, most farms have switched all their irrigation systems from standard pump motors to a variable speed with frequency drive motors that have a pressure transducer, and they will run the pump up, down to an idle according to load. And the electrical savings are significant.
But it's interesting. You talk about, I was just thinking about what you said there. You've got to do all these nice incremental little bits and pieces, but there is still the potential for somebody making a really big mistake on something like the heating system and really messing up all the benefits of all the smaller elements that they've done.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I've also seen growers that are so energy conscious, they ruin their crops. Like that's something we talk to our students about too, right? So if all you're focused on is energy, I'll give you a classic example. It's February. Okay. It's really cold in Canada in February. And so the temptation is to have everything buttoned up tight. Okay. And you're staring at your crop and you're proud because you've been looking at your grass and the boiler's hardly cycling and your energy consumption is minimal. But you have a problem because your greenhouse, and it may even, the humidity may be okay. Let's say it's at 80, 85%, something like that. It's on the higher end. Okay. What that grower doesn't realize is that operating at that higher humidity means that water is not moving through the plants very much and the entire crop slows down. Instead of finishing your Gerber crop in 8 weeks, it's going to take 12. Now you have 4 more weeks of energy consumption to finish that crop. So it's not as simple as just everything's about minimal energy. It's about what's the most efficient to my means. So you have to let some air in, you have to let humidity out, or you will be paying a different price other than energy.
You are, for want of a better word, you're singing a song that we sing there, which is it's not just about energy. It's why you're using energy in the first place. What is the focus of your business? And I think you touched on it earlier. You know, for a grower, the focus of your business is to make profit. And how do you make that profit? By growing the right product at the right time, at the right cost. Yeah. Interesting.
And it's critical because most of our big orders in greenhouses are pre-booked.
Yeah.
It's not like there's very few what we call spec growers where they grow a crop. When it's done, they try to sell it. That's not how it works. You know, you get an order for 40,000 pots of Gerbera and you have a 3-day window to deliver it. That means that you have an accuracy of plus or minus a day and a half over the span of 5 months. You cannot make mistakes.
Yeah.
I think this is where greenhouses are so interesting in that sometimes pricing does not matter because if the crop needs heat, the crop needs heat. And unfortunately, you would need to pay whatever you can pay just so you don't lose your $1 million of crops.
So snow.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also, and I know we briefly touched on climate change in the last episode, but I think that's where climate change is going to be especially interesting for greenhouses is we're going to kind of see some shifts in their energy consumption and maybe even a shift in when greenhouses start planting their crops and when they tear out their crops based on how our seasons are going to change as well.
I find historically when we work with customers, whether it's an operation in manufacturing or sometimes a grower in greenhouses, that they think we're going to come along here and tell them to disregard everything they need to do for production just for energy savings. And as John indicated, that is the worst thing that we could do and not anything that we want to do. But how do growers learn how to manage energy at the same time doing production? Is it through the college? Is it from lifelong experiences? How do they actually do that?
I'd love to say it's from the college, but it's not. I mean, to be honest, I'm probably a classic example, right? So I was trained as a molecular biologist. I worked in a lab and then I bought a greenhouse and I managed to figure it out. So I think I'm probably not that different than most, to be honest. We are mostly self-taught people who are curious and we're not stupid. We're smart enough to know when something makes sense.
Yep.
On a practical level, we have sort of a BS detector built in and it's the school of hard knocks. We've all made mistakes. I have some family in Scotland and the one has one of the biggest greenhouses up there that grows bedding plants, ships them all over the EU. And many years ago, I remember visiting and he had no computer, real primitive, big, but primitive operation. And he would go out at night and he'd check the night. He'd put his thumb in the wind and he'd bump the mixing valve a little bit and say, that'll do. And then he'd go to bed. And of course, the one night he bumped it wrong and he froze everything out. That's what we call the school of hard knocks. So he put a motorized mixing valve in and a computer. Go figure. So the school of hard knocks is learning from other people, networking. We meet and talk at conferences and we kind of get a sense of, what's going on. There are consultants that float around. Sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're not. Right. So you still have to filter and think. But.
Yep. Yeah, well, that's critical. It's important. I think in the case for when we're working with clients, it's important that they learn versus being told what to do, because being told what to do is short term. You need to learn this so you get better and better at what you need.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question, and I'm just gonna throw a slightly curveball at you here. You said you were looking for another career, so I'm going to suggest, how about you become a futurologist? And in your role as a futurologist, what do you see the future in the greenhouse sector with energy?
Oh, you may or may not like my answer.
Try me.
Give it a go, Derek.
So let me just frame my answer, okay? Greenhouses, never mind North America, okay? We live in a little bit of a self-fabricated, we are indulging ourselves with, organic farms and all this sort of perception of what sustainable living can look like, going back to donkeys with pans clanking on the sides because we think that's better, as opposed to technology, which is something we rely on regularly to improve our lives. Having said that, greenhouses are everywhere in the world. They are exploding. The world is building them at an unprecedented pace. Okay. We're talking, I show a picture to my students of one of the most sophisticated greenhouse farms that is in the world. And do you know where it is? Albania.
Wow.
Okay. They are building high tech greenhouses everywhere. And here in North America, we're like, oh, they burn carbon. We don't want them. But what? When you have climate change, you have unpredictable weather. We're dealing with a food supply crisis. We're dealing with, how do we feed a growing population? These are questions that everyone kind of thinks about. But the greenhouse sector, I believe, has a very significant role to play in the future of humanity and feeding us in a world with an unstable climate. And I think that everyone else in the world gets that, except us. I don't get it. Every single paper I've ever read shows that yields are 30% less on an organic farm. Last time I checked, the earth was not increasing its arable land. In fact, it's diminishing. So going to a system that has 30% lower productivity does not solve a food crisis. It doesn't. I don't care whose math you look at. They always have lower yields. The future is all about greenhouses. I'm not so sure about warehouses, but greenhouses. Yeah.
Well, I think you've passed your interview for the job as futurologist. Um, and I,
Yeah, but no one will believe me.
well, but is that not the whole point about futurology?
Yeah.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, I'm a great fan of science fiction, and I find it really interesting to watch historic science fiction and see what they were predicting. And, we should all be in flying cars now, but nobody ever predicted the smartphone and what we'd have from that. I mean, maybe the communicator in Star Trek was getting there, but not really. I think that's a very interesting view. It's a realistic view that with climate change, this is an answer that some people won't like from me. We're in this business of trying to help people mitigate climate change. I don't think we're going to mitigate it enough. I think we are going to have a chaotic future. And I find your view that a greenhouse provides a stable growing environment. And I think that's a really interesting view. Thank you for that.
I mean, climate aside, California still produces a significant portion of the produce that's consumed in North America, both Canada and the US. And California has been dealing with sodification of their soil for the last 10 years. It's been getting worse and worse and worse because they're using the same farmland and growing intensively on it, producing lettuce and carrots and all the things that we want to eat. But when you use fertilizers to push yields, you end up increasing trace sodium levels, and the soil is getting harder and harder to grow in. So even California is starting to entertain the idea of greenhouses because they realize that they just can't produce in their fields. Climate change alone, already before we knew about climate change, I'm saying there were other issues that were driving us into that area for
Yeah,
food.
and then we add, I was joking about vegans earlier, but we add more people moving to plant-based food. We're going to need more production than we've got.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think it's difficult to kind of talk about a standard because each parts of the world are at different stages. So for instance, we're starting to entertain vertical farming as well. in North America. But then when you're also looking back at the basics, in the Netherlands, most greenhouses have a cogen, or mostly all greenhouses there have a cogen. Whereas here in Leamington, Ontario, you don't really find that quite as often. It's battling climate change, battling energy and carbon usage, battling all these things, and then all these new technologies as well. So I think the greenhouse industry is going to be one to watch the next few years, especially.
I have an exciting, hopeful story to tell you. There's a greenhouse in Australia called Sundrop Farms, and they have a tower that takes seawater and sunlight is used to boil it to make steam. That steam generates electricity to run the farm, and the condensate is used to irrigate the crops. It is completely carbon neutral, and it produces superb vegetable crops. I think that greenhouses can be part of our energy solution, not just growing food. Like cogen is the easy one. It's funny you say that they have them everywhere in Holland, but that's partly because in Holland they have a different tax structure than in Canada. In Canada, the government's desperate for its tax money because it wants to waste it. And in Holland, they're like, fine, you either pay tax or you take what you're going to pay tax and you invest it in your business. And so everyone, of course, invests everything in their business because they don't want to pay tax. So their tax structure fosters innovation at a much faster pace than in Canada.
And the grid requirements are, there was different requirements as well. They were in need of power supply. Ontario, historically, on the last 10 years, we've had a surplus, so there hasn't been, but that's going to change. Derek, I did want to pick up because you did mention some work and experience you did in biomass. Do you want to discuss that? Because I don't.
Sure.
Opportunity.
Yeah, no. You know what? Heating with biomass was an amazing adventure. In the end, I broke even. I think I was lucky to break even. The investment was significant to put in the biomass boiler, but that's really the least of it, actually, because with biomass, you have to buy trucks, you have to have storage facilities, you have to have advanced conveying facilities to move those wood chips, and you have to source, talk about being on the phone, you have to source biomass material. And I got lazy and was tied in with one particular supplier and ended up they didn't have enough that winter. So I had to quickly hunt around to find someone else who had biomass. It was a lot of work. When I factored in my time, the labor of someone to operate that system negates the savings that I would have had. It was an immensely satisfying project, but the time was amazing. What I learned out of the biomass, what I learned most out of it all was that when we talk about so many tons of carbon going up the chimney, we're like, tons? What are you talking about, tons? It's just steam. Until you convert that to wood fiber and visualize what that is, then you have a respect for, okay, yeah, I get it. So, I mean, I was burning through a tractor trailer load of wood every 3 days. And that's 25 tons of wood. And, biomass is around 60% thermal efficiency. Obviously, it's not as good, but still, that's every 3 days. That's how much I'm converting into CO2. It was astonishing. It was humbling, to be honest.
And you would have been impacted by the moisture content of the wood that was delivered to you as well.
It was pretty dry. I was buying construction waste, so it's shredded. And it's stored indoors. It's a massive, massive warehouse. So it was dry. It would burn very well. Like the flame in the boiler was blue. That's about as efficient as it gets. It was not a lazy yellow flame. I put carbon monoxide sensors in the stack and I monitored. It was not bad. It was not a dirty system. I didn't have the low, slow burning. I built what's called the gasifying system. So it would kind of bake, and then the gas was then conveyed to the boiler where it then burned a second time. It was clean, but the biggest headache you had was you get cinder blocks or steel rebar contaminants that jam your auger. And it always happens at 2 a.m.
Middle of the night.
Yeah, it never happens at 2 p.m. It's always 2 a.m., right?
Yeah. That's what we found with solar people that we work with. Well, I think certainly, as you've suggested, with natural gas historically being lower, it wasn't probably or isn't attractive. But as In Canada, for our listeners from around the world, it's going to go up to $170 a ton per GJ by 2030. So that's added another, like ultimately it's going to be $2 a GJ just for the carbon tax. So you put that on top of the quality, on top of the transportation, on top of the distribution, it may be something that they will look at again, even with all the things that you're saying, but you have to be smart about it. As you said, this is not a slam dunk. You need to really be smart about what you're doing and know what you're getting into as well. Well, thank you for sharing that as well. I appreciate that.
Derek, thank you again for another great episode. To end this episode off, what are some tips or advice you have for greenhouses in regards to managing their energy? For instance, where do you think there is more flexibility that maybe growers and greenhouses don't really think about right now?
From a practical just remind, or maybe if someone hasn't thought about it before, but first of all, learn how to plot data on your climate computer and do it regularly. Keep track of your boiler cycling time, look at the time of day, get to know the rhythms of your greenhouse and see how it reacts. And you can make small changes, and in time you can achieve 5, maybe even 10% savings by being a little smarter about, how you use your heat and not take it for granted. Morning and evening are the two times that greenhouse growers have to pay most attention to for energy demand and where efficiencies can be had. For example, opening your energy curtain and closing your energy curtain, the timing of that can be tweaked. And as the days change, here our days lengthen and shorten significantly over the seasons. You can play with that, and you can look at the forecast and decide if it's worth opening sooner or not. And by just being there and paying attention on a daily basis, you can accumulate savings that add up.
Derek, do you want to mention, because I know gas is a big part, but now a lot of greenhouse operators are using lighting. Do you want to address lighting for them to think about, any practical things for them to consider on the lighting side?
Do your research. And don't believe the salesman. Do your research. Ask around, and I would say, I can get into spectrum and stuff like that, but from a practical perspective, the only place I really see LED lighting having an immediate useful impact is in propagation in greenhouses. Propagation, definitely there is an improvement under LED lighting. It's cost effective. The savings come back in terms of plant height control, reducing your labor for growth regulators and stuff like that. So if you're a propagator, you should definitely be looking at LED lighting. If you're a regular production person, be careful, be smart, do your research, check up references. Really important to check references. And if you're the first person, run away. Don't be the first person. Let someone else be brave.
John, any final comments for this episode?
No, I think this has been really interesting. I did like your comment about don't be the first. As somebody once said to me, you don't want to be on the bleeding edge of technology. You want to be, and I used to work for a firm that always allowed somebody else to innovate first and then followed. But then that doesn't make Steve Jobs of us, does it? And doesn't make us Apple and the largest listed company in the world. But then maybe we'll all survive.
There is an economics logic to it, though, because what we call following corporations are always the profitable ones. And you look at the cannabis sector, early adopters had to blaze the trail, and that was very expensive. And the people that come after don't have that cost. It's way easier for them to succeed.
I think you're right. In the majority of cases, there's just one or two disruptors who benefit from being out there first, aren't there? But generally, let somebody else make the mistakes and learn from them.
It's kind of cowardly, I know, but
yeah,
it makes sense business wise.
we're all into some form of risk management, aren't we? Yeah, thank you, Derek. It's been really interesting talking with you.
Dave, any final comments?
Yeah, it's been a joy, as expected, by the way. And we will take you up on that lighting podcast in the future.
Sure.
That would be great. Thank you very much for your time. It's been really interesting, as John suggested.
Thanks again, Derek, for your time, and hopefully we'll see you soon on that LED and lighting episode.
Okay. My
Have a
pleasure.
great day, everyone.
Hey, thank you,
Bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.